And in that system, of course, you lose the drivers, but you also lose the drivers in most of our natural habitat patches. Unless you're at Wakaiva, where they got our vigorous fire program to maintain the sandhill, or a little, I'd say, somewhat pathetic fire program at UCF where we try to burn. Very hard to get a permit. We're doing this here at UCF. That fire was the dominant in all of our upland ecosystems. So if you don't have it, the chance is you don't have the species you're supposed to have, and they're not distributed the way they're supposed to be distributed, and you've got some kind of different kind of system. So you lose that in urban systems. We have been working a lot with natives. We're not exclusively native at UCF. We celebrate horticultural diversity just like they do here at Lou Gardens from all around the world, but we definitely have pushing more towards native species and the use of native species as a backbone of a lot of our landscapes. And it's been a positive trend we hope to push forward even more because we recognize that importance. But getting back to Doug Tallamy, how many people have read this book or seen it? Good, then you're familiar with it. Doug has really been devoted a lot of his time to another entomologist, by the way, but he's devoted a lot of his time to try to make this case. And his case is, okay, Florida, for example. He's from Delaware, I think. You're going to have 30% urban area. If you think you're going to conserve all your species just in your parks and your natural lands, you're missing an opportunity. And you probably aren't going to sustain near what you could sustain if you tried to make sure you had as much of that biodiversity in as many places as you can. In many places as you can. Did I lose my thing?
The battery might have cut out. Try the mic stand.
Oh, my battery cut out. I can actually see it. Is this one good?
Should be.
We've been through a lot. I think it's, we've been through a lot of technical challenges, but they worked out really well. So one of the reasons is the species area curve, and Doug points this out. Generally, if you collect species, we all know the more area you sample, the more species you're going to get. And it does level off. And one of the things that I don't agree with on Doug totally is, Doug says if you lose 50% of your species area, you lose 50% of your species. Well, let's look at that. If we lost half our area, we have nearly all our species still. Depends on where you are on the curve. So you can lose a lot of habitat and still maintain most of the species is the point. Now what happens in the long term is anybody's guess. But the point he makes is if we're making 30% of the landscape urban and we're just going to erase all the native biodiversity from that, how are we going to sustain biodiversity to the degree that we'd like to? So that's a good point, that the more of those species that are occupying more area, the more likely we'll have more of them. That's totally true. And of course, native plants feed insects, is his other point. And based on our earlier discussion, insects are making up most of the biodiversity. And you're all familiar with it because you're native plants people, but let's review it for those who haven't thought about it in a while. Native plants support more insect life. They support more insect biomass. Okay? So that's one of the reasons there, but that's not to say you won't find an introduced horticulture variety that somehow magically supports insect life. They do. A lot of them support things like scale insects. But but chances are they're not going to do anything like a native species does. And that has to do with more than just how insects are being affected, because we all know from Ecology 101, through the trophic dynamic theory of ecology, that every time you move up a trophic level, you have about 10% of the energy transferred. So from the sun, the plants absorb so much. When the insects eat the plant, you get about 10% going up because you lose heat and energy at each stage. So if you have fewer insects, you got fewer birds, you've got fewer insect-eating, insectivorous mammals. And you'd think, well, here are native plants, why doesn't the same amount of energy get transferred up? Why not? Why doesn't that energy get transferred? Well, that gets us back to evolution. It doesn't get transferred because a lot of insects have spent about 400,000 or 500,000 years adapting themselves to the chemistry of the plants that grow in an area and have developed relationships over evolutionary time that aren't necessarily going to be replaced by sweet viburnum if they did it here in Florida. Okay? So that's the theory, and Doug's done a lot of work. I haven't, because I'm an administrator. but he's done a lot of good research where he has actually looked at insect production on introduced and native plants, caterpillars, the whole 9 yards for his region in Delaware, and has shown this pretty well for his region. Now, we could do that research in Florida. It'd be interesting to do it. We'd probably find a similar thing. The point is that it's different depending on whether you have native plants. So here is my cartoon diagram to illustrate that point for those of you who didn't get it the first time around. Native plants produce bugs which feed birds. Now, his theory is that if you have alien plants, same number of plants, fewer insects, and then you've got less of that energy that you have trapped in the plant is being transferred up the trophic food web. So that's one of the reasons we can really argue why you want to use native plants. It's not just because you got a pollinator, obviously they need flower and nectar source. They need the leaf source. They need the leaf of the plant. And in most neighborhoods I live in, the only leaf of a native plant anyone is going to eat is an oak leaf. Because in my neighborhood, that's the only native plant that there is in the entire neighborhood is oak and magnolia and sweet gum. And an occasional red maple. Only the trees, no mid-story natives. Few people have found firebush. 2 of them, 2 people in my neighborhood. So the point is, this is why when you walk through neighborhoods like mine, it is truly like Silent Spring. We didn't need the pesticides even probably. Because we're just not planting things that the bugs need and want to grow. Some of us are. People plant zinnias and stuff, and the butterflies come in. In addition to that, which is obviously very important for native plants, and y'all are aware of that, how we manage plant also affects trophic transfer. What I mean by that? What I mean by that is, if we've got a plant that flowers and produces fruit, and in, let's say in landscape terms, we planted it as a hedge, and we go and we trim it, and we trim off the flowers, and the fruits never get produced, there's not a lot of trophic transfer going on. And I know you all know that, and you probably let things get a little wild if you're into your native plant thing. But we plant a lot of Simpson stoppers at UCF as shrubs, and you never see a fruit flower, because they're trimmed every month. Somebody comes by. Now, if you let a Simpson stopper grow, a Simpson stopper will grow and have these beautiful fragrant flowers in the spring, which have abundant pollinators on them. It will grow into a nice little tree, not quite like a crepe myrtle, but up like that, if you train it a little bit, and produces these berries that will bring in mockingbirds. If you grow this, you'll see a fat squirrel sitting up there, just sitting on the branch like this, and eating berries. So, you're only going to get that if you manage the plant that way. And we do manage a lot of plants in the wrong way. I'll show you another one in a minute. The mushroom ligustrum is one. Ligustrum is an introduced plant, but it's a pretty good pollinator plant if you let it bloom. If you let it bloom. The other big issue, and if you're into bee stuff, and if you want to become bee certified, you got to get into your pesticides. Big issue there. We put about 20% of the world's pesticide on ground in the United States. And kind of scratch the surface. I mean, a lot of it's put out to kill bugs, so that's going to kill bugs right away. Herbicides are killing native weeds that probably support life. A lot of things like fungicides and other things we've studied, and one of the reasons we know this now, because who on God's name is going to study the effect of a fungicide on a bug? Well, somebody who studies honeybees, because people care about honeybees. And they've done a lot of research lately because of colony collapse disorder, the bee decline. Bees have been shown to be sensitive to fungicides. Health of the bee colony is lower. Orientation of the bee to the flower is worse, just based on correlations with fungicide levels. So it's not just insecticides. The neonicotinoids, which we've all heard about. I don't want to impugn the whole industry because they're very useful for the indoor floral industry. I'm not saying they shouldn't exist, but we put way too many of them out there. Here's a study. Well, I had to show Rachel Carson in Science Spring because you'd think since that was back in the 60s we solved that problem, right? That doesn't exist anymore. You've got the specialized insecticides. They're much less toxic. DDT's gone. I wish I could say be more enthused. Neonicotinoids, here's a study from the Netherlands. You can tell because they got names like Jonga Johns and Turnhout and Foppen. You know they got to be Dutch. Is that they showed declines in insectivorous birds. And they showed that it was related to high neonicotinoid concentrations. So they're spraying so much on their agricultural areas, it's getting in the plants, there's fewer insects in the areas. The other data in the paper showed there's fewer insects, there's fewer insectivorous birds. And then neonicotinoids, for those of you who don't know, are systemic. They're taken up by the plant. So when the bug eats the plant, or if a bee visits a flower, it may not kill it, but now it's got neonicotinoids in its system. And there's been a lot of research been going on that because of the importance of honeybees to people. So we're getting some knowledge on that. But at any rate,
The neonicotinoids then get in the pollen and the nectar, right?
yes, pollen and nectar and honey. If you're eating your honey, you better hope your bees weren't out on your neonicotinoid treated plants. So yes, it is an issue in the pollen, and they get up into the flower. The nectar. Again, some of them are useful, some of them are more toxic. A lot of research going on because of that. Anyway, you got to cut back on your pesticides. Everyone loves pollinators, and we do a lot for pollinators. We're doing stuff for pollinators at UCF right now. It is good because if you're going to have charismatic megafauna as an entomologist, that's about it. Your butterflies, and people seem to like bees. So it is a good sell. Now we have had a decline. I see these graphs, I'm kind of sad because I don't think I'm that old, but to think about that, how much diversity and all these problems have happened in my lifetime. It's like we had the environmental movement and all that. Was not supposed to like fix some of these things. You really start to see these really big declines in biodiversity. This is bees, for crying out loud, in Illinois. Well, I already told you Illinois doesn't have any land left anyway. It's all corn and soybean, but still, they had bees. Comparing a couple of surveys, this is 1971. And then they had 2 later surveys in these 2 years. Now maybe there's other reasons for this. This is what they found in the number of bee individuals sampled and the bee species richness. It's like there's fewer species out there. 2013. So that's like, people are concerned. You all heard about pollinator crisis. Everyone is concerned about the bees. I know right now. People are concerned about bees. That doesn't mean they really understand them very well. This was an interesting paper that came out a couple weeks ago where they showed people a picture and they said, hey, which of these is a bee? And people didn't really get these ones very right, about 40%. Everyone likes the bees that are fuzzy and look like bumblebees and honeybees, but I think at UCF, and I got my student Shiala's back there. Say hi, Shiala. She's a bee nut. And she's looking at native bees in our natural lands and their association with different flowers in our natural lands. I have another student looking at bees and pollinators in our pollinator gardens and landscapes to compare what kinds of fauna are these different communities supporting. But at UCF, we have 105 bee species that have been collected at UCF. So there's a lot of bees in the world, and most of them look more like this than like that. So anyway, people are aware, though. It's good that people are aware. And it's a rallying cry for a lot of people right now. And maybe we'll get Orlando to become a Bee City USA. That would be great. We're applying for Bee Campus USA at UCF soon. You have to have pollinator issues and you have to address the pesticide issue. Now, this is probably the best plant, one of the best plants in the world right here. Salt palmetto. A lot of people who come from elsewhere, like landscape architects, they hate salt palmetto. Like you meet landscape men, well, I hate salt palmetto. I look at them like they're crazy. You've got to be crazy. You hate salt palmetto. There's a landscape architect, I'm not going to mention any names, down Lake None, I'm not going to mention any places. Who was talking about how she hates, she goes, salt palmetto brings in rats. Rats. I'm like, not if you manage it right, it doesn't. It's all overgrown. You got to manage it right. You do have to manage salt palmetto if you want to use it as a horticultural thing. Anyway, I love salt palmetto. Anyway, this is Mark Dayrick, who works down at Archbold. He's a crazy old entomologist down there. A fantastic naturalist, probably one of the greatest living naturalists in the state of Florida. He is a phenomenal guy. He just keeps ticking, too. He did a little study at Archbold, which has a 5,000-acre reserve, so it's a natural reserve. How many insects visit flowers of salt palmetto? And this is the kind of thing Mark loves to do. Collect as many things as he can. And he's just answering a question. He's not doing a research project. He's just answering a question. How many bugs? So, now if you raise your hand, you can't raise it twice. So once you raise it, you give it up. I'm going to give categories, and I'm going to get higher. And you raise your hand. How many people think 0 to 50 insects visited the salt palmetto flower?
What time frame?
Just the total year. Well, it blooms for several weeks. It has a bloom period. During the whole bloom period, for however much time they sample, they probably sample over several years. How many think 50 to 100? 50 to 100. How many think 100 to 150? How many think 150 to 200? How many think 200 to 250? They're still coming. How many people think 250 to 300 insect species? And how many people think more than 300? Awesome! Got some real enthusiastic naturalists in here. 117 fly species, 80 wasp species, 52 beetle species, 23 bee species, and then everybody else.
Wow.
So, wow. Now, I told you I wasn't going to tell you a how-to thing. If you plant saw palmetto in your yard in an urban area, you're not going to get 311 species. My point is, it is a key species in Florida for spring bloom. It is a major nectar producer, and it's a great landscape plant. And if everybody has a fire bush, if they've got room, everybody should have a saw palmetto.
Yeah.
Everybody should have a saw palmetto. You just got to know how to manage them. At any rate, my point is well taken here. I think you see. We can't even fathom the diversity that our native systems had and have, and the kind of things that were supported. And they really do depend on those native species to have the kind of resources that they need to survive. Like I said, we've been planting with native gardens. Now you say, that's not native. Yeah, I love that big penta, that big one. But most of these are native species. All the rest are, except for the, I got some dwarf powder puff over there, which I like. But we've done a couple pollinator gardens. Some students had some initiatives, so we've been doing that. And of course, we get all our stuff from Mark Gotts because he has such great stuff. I think we have 49 species in 3 different gardens, and so we've just started to work on this. Now, with landscape architects don't like this. This looks messy, it's not clean, so getting them to think about how they can use native material. One of my goals in planting these 2 gardens was to plant some of the things that some landscape architects that are more into natives, like Karina Vaudry have proposed, to show my landscape architects, see, this one is a pretty good plant. It stays green, it stays well behaved. It can't be too crazy for landscape architects to get excited about it, but silkgrass is fantastic. This little Florida pennyroyal, you know, black-eyed Susans get ugly when they're done blooming, so you hide them in the back a little bit. But basically, we've been exploring with this and having the pollinators, and then we also, to do Bee City, have to address our pesticide use, and so there's a lot of work we have to do on that as well. We obviously don't use them here, but we do use them on campus. So pollinator gardens are one way, and you all know that different species of butterfly and things like that have very specific relationships with particular species, like the Gulf fritillary and passion vine. Tiger swallowtail, sweet bay magnolia, you know, they do exist on some other things. The white peacock, of course, depends on frog fruit, which is its host plant. And frog fruit is that little weed that you see in your yard. It is also a fantastic native species. We should have a frog fruit chapter. But only after we get a Biden's Alba chapter, which is probably the other best species in Florida. And then you have things like the fiery skipper, another one of my favorites, which can live on St. Augustine. If you don't spray it with herbicide, and if you don't have the company come and spray pesticide once a month, you might actually support some things on grass at the larval stage. And there's lots of people who can tell you better than I can about how to grow a flower pollinator garden for butterflies. Birds are important, obviously. We do have the mammals, so let's not forget birds. I don't do a lot of the birds, but Audubon has a great site. You can plug in your email address, your zip code, and it gives you a whole list of species, which are actually good species. A lot of natives in there for Florida. I did it for my code, and of course IFIS and the native plant folks, you guys have guides on how to do that. And it's important to think about birds because they're another key aspect. I think we could have a lot more birds in our neighborhoods if we gave them more food. They have to eat. And you can plant stuff. They eat beautyberry. Serves not only native species, but migrating birds coming through this time of year will feed on beautyberries. Firebush, anything that's fruiting this time of year can be very important for migrating birds, as well as for the local birds. And the other thing we talked about earlier, we talked about trees and mid-story and grass, having that combination of different heights and architectures of habitat are obviously very important for birds. So birds will come along too, and again, if we have more insects in our yards, we'll probably support more bird life as well. Now there are some drawbacks to this more ecological approach. And again, I don't want to get people too sanguine about things, because one of the things I didn't go into in any great depth that I did want to talk about was, you know, I live in a neighborhood that's very characteristic of the dominant suburban paradigm, not only in Orlando but everywhere in the world right now, but particularly in Orlando. And I've mentioned how many people live in a neighborhood like mine, a walled suburban community. It is the dominant. If you've been in a house built in 20 years and you don't live in if you live in an HOA, it's dominant. Whether y'all live there or not, that's what's out there. Big part of the landscape. Not a lot, it's a look that they're going for. They're going for a look, and it doesn't have a lot of natives in it. And so you kind of, what they've done, what Doug Tallamy's done, they've done some research where they kind of, let's get people excited. We're going to use an experiment. We're going to plant an ecological landscape in people's yards. And people agreed to this. And then we'll collect all kinds of data, not just biological, they collect a lot of social data on it. So they actually had yards that people agreed, we're gonna plant the whole thing for you. Meadows, and we're gonna have the wild plants. And it went pretty well. People got it, they understood it, most people liked it, most people liked the aesthetic of it.